Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Borderoux, Director of the Armstrong Browning Library, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the ABL for our annual Benefactors Day celebration. Benefactors Day provides us the opportunity to thank publicly those who support the work of the library. So to those whose financial contributions make the growth and preservation of our collections, our research and teaching fellowships, our internships, and public events such as this one possible, thank you. And to those who engage with the library through classroom instruction, who create and share new knowledge gleaned from the collections, who attend library lectures and conferences, so that's everybody in this room today, and who promote the library and its resources to the local community and the broader scholarly community, thank you. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for today's program, the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, which provides support and expertise to find solutions to food insecurity, and most recently received a $5 million USDA grant to expand access to food for students living in rural Texas communities, and Baylor's Medical Humanities Program, which prepares undergraduate students for careers in healthcare by providing them the opportunity to reflect on the deepest meanings of health and healing, to consider the ethical and spiritual issues they will encounter as healthcare professionals, and to reflect on the sacred nature of medicine as a vocation. So to Mr. Jeremy Everett, Dr. Kathy Cry, and Ms. Amanda Chasteen of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty, and to Dr. Lauren Barron of Baylor's Medical Humanities Program, thank you for the work that you do that makes an impact at the local, state, and national levels, and for partnering with us this afternoon. I would now like to invite Dr. Joshua King, Margaret Root Brown Chair in Robert Browning and Victorian Studies, to introduce our speaker. Following the lecture, Ms. Laura French, Curator of the Armstrong Browning Library, will close our program. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Joshua King, and I'm very privileged to introduce my friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Lisa Scholl. Now, I've known Lisa for a while, I've been deeply impressed by her, and I could go on for quite a long time singing her praises, so I'm going to restrain myself to just a few remarks. She's currently head of Kathleen Lumley College, the graduate residential college of the University of Adelaide, and she's demonstrated remarkable breadth and depth as a scholar, illuminating intersections between literature, religion, economics, hunger, food, insecurity, and medicine. I could list a lot of publications, amongst which would be the ongoing Palgrave Encyclopedia on Victorian Women's Writing, which a number of us are involved in contributing to, has something around 600 entries and maybe 15 volumes by the end, so small task. But among her many publications are 3 books, including Hunger Movements in Early Victorian Literature, Want, Riots, and Migration, and Hunger, Poetry, and the Oxford Movement, the Tractarian Social Vision, the last of which will appear in 2020 with Bloomsbury. Through the lens of the 19th century British literature and culture, these books reveal hunger as a many-faceted phenomenon, not only gnawing emptiness in the belly, or misfortune suffered by some, but a force of culture, something imagined and debated across societies. Hunger can be protested as an injustice, drive people from their places, ignite political struggle. It can be used as an image of individual and corporate ambition in an increasingly violent, competitive society. It can be eclipsed by satisfaction and taste as metaphors for a fulfilled, cultured civilization. It challenges emotions and spirituality. For example, can those with enough to eat face the need of those without, exercising sympathy without becoming overwhelmed, praying without simply uttering pious platitudes? Can poetic form help one practice such restrained, caring attention? These are the kinds of questions Lisa's books have asked about the Victorian past. But as you can tell, they are questions that live with us. And her work is concerned to help us face the enduring relevance of struggles that won't die. Her recently edited collection of essays, she's edited several, takes this perspective into the medical humanities, asking how we can maintain the importance of understanding the human within a scientific, technological age and with an historical perspective. Her ability to connect the past to the present and to help us re-engage injustices and complex social concerns in our time with new insight was on display just yesterday. She led a group of 17 undergraduates from Baylor in a workshop on food insecurity, using literature from the 18th and 19th centuries and even a rare manuscript of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's in our collections. I was so impressed by her ability to take students from a range of majors who had never met her, make them her friends almost instantly, and empower them to explore texts apparently very distant from their own time and own lives, with an eye for how they can have meaning now, how they can help us address issues of hunger now. By the end, she had them working together to draw upon what they'd read to compose imagined text messages about issues of hunger, food insecurity, and ethical restraint directly relevant to their campus and their time. Anyone who can get students to move from Elizabeth Barrett Browning to texting and do so meaningfully has got my respect. Today, Lisa will draw upon her research related to her next book, Fasting and Wasting, Religion, Nutrition, and Social Responsibility in Victorian Britain. She's examined the ways in which fasting was regarded from multiple angles, religious, medical, and literary, and not just as a spiritual, but also as an ethical practice, connecting individuals to concern for the health of their communities. Please join me in welcoming Lisa as she shares with us about healthy bodies, healthy souls, 19th century medicine, religion, and literature.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. I'm really, now I can see people. That's better. That's, okay, we're good. I'm really grateful to be here. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Joshua King and Jennifer Borderud for giving me the opportunity to be at Baylor for 3 months during this fellowship. It has been amazing. I'm also grateful to the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty and also to the Medical Humanities Program for co-sponsoring today and for the support they've given me. I don't want to go into a long list of all of the people individually because that would add half an hour onto my talk today. And there is a reception for us to get to afterwards. But there are so many people here and some also who haven't been able to make it today who have just been amazing. I love Baylor a lot. I've been here a few times now. So this has been really wonderful. And also, I have recently got a puppy that I'll be getting when I go back home in December. Some of you have seen pictures of the puppy. If you're interested, I do have a picture on my computer. I can show you afterwards. But my new puppy's name is Baylor. So, and he got that name before he got his pedigreed name, so it really is his name. So my project that I'm working on now actually started here at the ABL a couple of years ago. On the last day that I was in the library, I came across an anonymous pamphlet called Remarks on Fasting and the Disciplining of the Body in a letter from a physician to a clergyman. It was published in 1848. What really caught my attention was the way that medical thought was engaging with religion. This pamphlet was the start of my project of looking at the history of fasting, not just as a spiritual discipline, but as an ethical one, connecting individual physical health to the health of the community. The way in which medicine, religion, and literature entwine in this topic comes from the slippages that occur between ideas of the individual body, the social body, and the body of Christ. As much as a lot of current research suggests a separation between science and religion, and the 19th century in particular as a time in which medicine was being professionalised and religion was being moved to the margins, from the reading I've been doing for this project, it becomes really clear that theology and medicine were actually operating in dialogue, building and informing each other. The two literary figures that I'll be looking at today, Christina Rossetti and Alice Meynell, were significant because of their public impact. Both were incredibly popular writers, but they also deserve recognition for the theological and social visions that they imparted through their literary and public engagement. And so a part of my purpose is to show how their voices contributed to the understandings of health and well-being in 19th century Britain. As far as fasting is concerned, my particular interest is not so much in the act of fasting for personal spiritual growth or to control body weight, but to recover the social justice element of fasting. Edward Pusey, who some of you may have heard of, was one of the founders of the Oxford movements. And the Oxford movement was a revival movement in the Church of England that influenced both Rossetti and Meynell and a lot of the medical doctors that I work with. Pusey wrote 2 tracts on the benefits and the system of fasting that entwine individual and communal concerns. Yes, fasting was about spiritual growth, but such growth is made evident through a greater concern for the less privileged in the community. Fasting was also a prophetic statement against the excesses of the age and led individuals to consider ethically what their bodies actually needed to consume. My engagement with nutrition comes from this direction. I'm going to talk about the way in which medicine and theology talked about the relationship between the body and soul and the health of both, and the way that this then informed the idea of a healthy society. I'll trace this from the 1830s through to the 1850s, which will set up the context for looking at works by Rossetti and Meynell that were written later in the century. In the wake of industrialisation and the developments around chemistry and physiology, medical scientists and even some theologians referred to the human body as a machine or as a laboratory. And I think probably a lot of us are familiar with the idea of society as the social machine. But the 19th century was also the time when the idea of the social body became entrenched, wrapped up in ideas of public health as much as the community of the church, but also in response to that mechanisation of the social machine. A body, as Catherine Gallagher notes, responds sensorially and has vitality. It's sentient and it has the capacity either to grow or to die. The health of a nation's body then becomes a symbol for its moral or spiritual health. Pamela Gilbert complicates this idea by asking, where does the individual body end and the social body begin? In what consists the boundary between the private and the public? Many of the medical doctors, particularly in the 1830s, still persisted, though, in the metaphor of body as a machine. And the reason for this was to create a sense of scientific distance. In the Bridgewater treatises, most of which I wasn't allowed to cut the pages, but it was pretty special to find copies that had uncut pages. This was a series that was commissioned by the Earl of Bridgewater, examining the natural sciences as evidence of the glory of God in creation. And I have here 3 of the doctors who contributed. Up the top, we've got John Kidd, we've got William Prout in the middle, and down the bottom is Peter Mark Roger. So in his contribution, John Kidd emphasises that he has been strictly called upon to consider not the moral but the physical condition of man, while Prout states that a living being considered as an object of chemical research is a laboratory within which a number of chemical operations are conducted. But even with this distancing impetus, there's a recognition of a connection between body and soul that brings such distancing into question. Roget, although using language of the animal body as a machine, asserts the power of feeling to challenge the extreme focus of the physical. He writes, "But can this, which is mere physical existence, be the sole end of life? Is there no further purpose to be answered by structures so exquisitely contrived? And really through the aesthetic language, he's creating a tension between his scientific distance and this idea of the spirit or the soul. Within the Bridgewater treatises, although many of the contributors talk extensively about nutrition, Prout is probably the most direct about the importance of food restraint and moderation. He writes, "Providence has gifted man with reason. To his reason, therefore, is left the choice of his food and drink, and not to instinct, as among the lower animals. It thus becomes his duty to apply his reason to the regulation of his diet, to shun excess in quantity and what is noxious in quality, to adhere, in short, to the simple and the natural, among which the bounty of his Maker has afforded him an ample selection, and beyond which, if he deviates, sooner or later, he will suffer the penalty." Although he doesn't explicitly use the term fasting, Prout also goes on to discuss food abstinence as a natural and healthy part of human digestion. Many animals can and do live for a considerable time on substances contained in their own bodies. Thus, hibernating animals have the ability to assimilate further those matters which have already become a part of themselves. Consequently, such a faculty of progressive organisation as we have supposed actually exists. And a sort of digestion is carried on in all parts of the body to fit for absorption and future appropriation those matters which have already been assimilated. The connection between health and food restraint that these doctors express is echoed in Edward Pusey's 2 tracts on the benefits of the system of fasting. It's in the theological context that the ideas of the individual's body's health, and how to maintain that health becomes extended to the health of the social body, by virtue of the emphasis placed on the church as one body of many parts, or the body of Christ. In suggesting that the role of fasting is to curb luxury, self-satisfaction, and corruption, Pusey addresses what many saw as the moral disease of the social body. This is emphasised further as he goes on to say, "A true fast is not merely to keep under the body, but to give to the widow or the poor the amount of that which thou wouldst have expended upon thyself." Fasting is meant to reinforce community connection and community aid, as well as an understanding of one's own position and responsibility within the social body. This responsibility is perhaps further reinforced, as Pusey says that fasting requires real self-denial, but that this must be in whatever degree we may be able to bear it without diminishing our own usefulness. Fasting to the extent of compromising one's own health and vitality is detrimental, not just to oneself, but to the social body. In the second tract, published 2 years later, Pusey goes on to talk more about the health benefits of fasting as he responds to questions that had arisen from the first. He makes it clear that styles of fasting can be individuated, particularly taking into consideration states of health. He suggests too that rather than sudden abstinence, people should reduce their portions rather than skipping whole meals. This also prevents following fasts with intemperance and gluttony, an idea that is echoed in remarks on fasting. Importantly, ideas of national character, and therefore the health of the nation, are linked directly in this tract to the kind of self-government that fasting induces. Heading into the 1840s, we begin to see more discussions emerging on the relationship between the body and the soul. The physician George Moore definitively separates them, with the soul being the individual intelligent being which actuates the body. The body is merely a location for the soul, but even so, as much as bodies become interchangeable in this philosophy, it remains important for the body to be healthy to maintain the soul's health. Similar to Prout, Moore states that the human chooses not merely according to appetite, but to conviction. But in his separation of body and soul, it's implied that a disordered physical appetite is due to a disordered body. He then argues that a physiologically diseased or disordered nervous system will affect the soul, potentially leading to insanity, and that it's the body that needs to be brought to health to make the soul healthy. Importantly, in terms of food restraint, he argues that the attention or acuity brought to the mind through the sensory experience of absence is good for the soul. Thus, a man may attend to his stomach till he feels the process of digestion. In spite of his understanding of the separation of the body and soul, Moore goes to some length to discuss the need to govern our passions and our appetites in a social context. However, his motives are more along the lines of individuals restraining themselves to build the national character, and the individuals being healthy in body and soul in order to create a stable, healthy society, rather than some kind of idea that sees a direct correlation with my being healthy and social justice. Other understandings of the relationship between body and soul had a much more tangible and pressing connection to social justice because of the belief that the body and soul were indivisible and that both would be resurrected in the afterlife. Thus, caring for the health of the body was as important as caring for the soul. Robert Wilson Evans, a clergyman, was extremely sceptical of the excessive focus on the spirit to the detriment of the body. In his Ministry of the Body, he associates fasting with this kind of excess. He argues for the spirituality of civil social duty and suggests that spirituality separated from the body becomes selfishness, which leads to the public mind becoming diseased. When he talks about the body, it's difficult to distinguish between the individual and the social body. He says, "We think to go by pure abstract spirit, and so far to neglect the province of the body that we find some actually laying it down as a rule that the further they go from the bodily, the nearer they come to the spiritual." And we get this kind of idea in the idea of denying the flesh and having that related to fasting. This abstraction, denying one's individual body, as well as removing oneself from the social body through fasting, as he goes on to discuss directly, is actually an abdication of true spiritual responsibility. Fasting achieves nothing. When we have denied in any way the body, do we in so much necessarily advance into the spirit? When we starve the body, do we feed the spirit? When we humble the body, do we exalt the spirit? Evans's argument against fasting concerns the individualism he sees it imbibing. He says here, the spiritualist makes individualism the centre of his system. I need to explain here. So when Evans talks about spiritualism and materialism, he's talking about those who either see the afterlife as just the spirit being resurrected, or if they also believe in the resurrection of the body, which he terms as materialist, which is confusing because we use materialist in different ways now. But just so you understand where Evans is coming from. He says, properly beginning with faith, the spiritualist very improperly refines this quality to mere sentiment, being naturally jealous that it should be so material as to have any relation to definite work. And when he cannot deny that it must have been an outward expression, he so exclusively dwells upon it as the one qualification, and in the same breath so severely arraigns all human work that he practically comes to hold it much in the same way as they held charity, who were content to say, "Depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled." It wants growth from want of exercise on its proper outward objects. Instead of encouraging individual spiritual growth through fasting, Evans asserts active interconnectedness as a social body through exercising the principles of faith, deliberately using the language of strengthening and working muscles. He concludes, thus the church, according to scripture, is at the very least a body of men, gendered, I know, linked by bonds of visible action, And this action cannot but start with the joint adoration and service of God, and thence proceed blessed, hallowed, and consented to the work of spiritual and bodily benefit to man. This attitude aligns with the Oxford movement's ideas that the natural progression from individual spiritual growth is active social work in the community. And this brings me to remarks on fasting. And I'm particularly excited about this text this week because as of Tuesday, I believe it was, I've been able to identify the author as the physician and surgeon Robert Bentley Todd, who was one of the founders of King's College Hospital in London. He was a prolific contributor to the body of medical knowledge that emerged from the 19th century. He has a paralysis named after him, Todd's paralysis. He worked a lot on epilepsy and one of the founders of neuroscience. He edited the encyclopedia on physiology and anatomy. So he was a bit prolific. He was also in the inner circle of the Oxford movement. Why it's even more exciting for me that it's him who is the author is that as someone who trained medical students, he explicitly wrote and spoke against the way in which religion was being sidelined in medical education in favour of narrower training in hard sciences. He was also known to be critical of some of the extreme dieting crazes that were emerging in the middle of the century. But I will get to the text at hand, and I'd be happy to answer. I don't know everything about him yet because this has been since Tuesday, but I'm really happy to answer as many questions as I can about him later. But to this text, Remarks on Fasting is written as a direct response to Evans's Ministry of the Body. Evans's text was published in the preceding year by the same publisher, and Todd cites Evans in a very flattering manner, while also challenging throughout Evans's central criticisms on fasting. Todd acknowledges that ill-directed fasting can be dangerous, especially if at other times diet is not carefully regulated. And he does admit that it has done serious harm to many persons of delicate constitution. However, he also emphasises that for the most part, society is given to gluttony and could therefore benefit both health-wise and spiritually by proper fasting, something that he, as a physician, is more than happy to offer to teach Evans, the clergyman, so that the clergyman can teach his flock. He agrees with Evans on the importance of caring for the body because of its intimate association with the soul, and like Evans, he acknowledges one's responsibility to the body. Yet rather than seeing fasting as preventing this, he argues, nothing is better calculated to remind us of the charge which is laid upon us in the exercise of our bodily functions than the practice of fasting at stated periods as enjoined by our church. The frequent recurrence of the inquiry how far our senses and appetites are under our control is a discipline which cannot fail to produce the most wholesome effects upon both body and soul. He goes on to counter Evans's concerns regarding the apparent individualist agenda by proposing a number of questions that provide the parameters for healthy self-reflection during fasting, such as whether one is using one's body with an eternal perspective or merely employing it as an instrument or machine, or if one is indulging appetites that need to be curbed, or alternatively neglecting the warnings of legitimate appetite. Reminiscent of Pusey, one of his friends I now discover, fasting should not lead one's body to falling out of repair and becoming unable to respond to the impulses of the mind, which in its turn, such as the intimacy of the union of both, languishes and falls into decay or, losing its harmony of action, deviates into some strange paths, dragging the body with it to the serious injury of both. The physician putting forward such boundaries states, if the observance of the fasts of the church lead to such reflections as these, I can conceive no practice which is better calculated to subserve the highest physical and moral ends by giving habits of self-control, by promoting temperance of mind as well as of body, by maintaining a vigilant superintendence over the actions of both and over their mutual influence upon each other, and by weaning the mind from inordinate desires. Another way in which Todd aligns with Pusey is in suggesting smaller portions rather than complete abstinence from meals, and arguing that this discipline is even harder. He writes, "I'm persuaded that to the vast majority of persons, it is an act of greater self-discipline to curtail the quantity usually taken at a meal and to refrain from what could be grateful to the palate than to give up a meal altogether." Another interesting aspect, which I don't really have time to go into right now, is that Todd then goes on to prescribe in some detail what he sees as constituting a normal diet in order to allow people to determine if they fall on either side of excess, either eating too much or too little. It isn't actually that restrictive. Breakfast involves 6 slices of bread, 2 slices of bacon, and hot chocolate with lots of milk and sugar. I did say 6 slices of bread. So there is a whole fascinating passage, and again, that's something I'd love to talk to you about later. But I'm going to move into the 1850s now with Robert Lee's What Christianity Teaches Respecting the Body. In this text, we start to get a really strong connection to social vision. This sermon has almost constant slippages between the individual and social body, while also emphasising how entwined body and soul are. Neither can be classed separately as man. You aren't human unless you have both. It's in this close interdependence that Lee argues that we need to look after our bodies and suggests that the things to be avoided in this endeavour include bad or insufficient food and intemperance. And it's important to think that, as with Todd, it's not just the amount of food, but the quality of food that is really important. And this is the time when the science of nutrition is really starting to be formed. A lot of work is being done in Germany. I had to cut out some of my Germans in order to reduce the size of this paper. But there's some really interesting conversations going on there as well. He then links these aspects directly to public health in a way that the previous medical doctors and theologians I've referred to couldn't, because the first Public Health Act was only passed in 1848. So the way that Lee connects individual health to the social body, speaking of preventable diseases, the constitution of society and the laws of health, reveals that there was a vocabulary around public health available to him that hadn't been available to earlier doctors and theologians. In Lee's social vision, we can see the understanding of the body and its relationship to the social body in spiritual as well as economic terms, written through material health concerns like the cholera epidemics and the poor nutrition that resulted from poverty. He talks about curing the community, not just through aid or charity, but through personal and familial responsibility for hygiene and nutrition. But he also recognises the disparity between those who are a part of an ill-fed population existing next to those who live too luxuriously. It becomes a social duty to look after one's individual body so that we remain useful, again, connecting back to Pusey, and also that we should seek to alleviate poverty where we can. Self-care is not enough, but we must care for other members of the social body. And one of the most profound statements he writes, I find, is, "The patience which endures removable ills is unacceptable." Lee concludes that if one can't be persuaded to look after one's own body, one won't be convinced to look after one's soul. The onus of social health lies in individual health, but the willingness or otherwise to engage with healthy habits reveals the health of the nation's soul. So all of these ideas become entwined and fall back onto each other in a really interesting way. I'm going to turn now to Rossetti and Mannel to look at some of the ways that they engaged with fasting. Both women lived in London and were directly involved with social work in their communities. And from that perspective, they engaged with issues of poverty, waste, and consumerism in their literary work. A part of my argument is that the fasts and the feasts of the Anglican liturgical calendar, which both Rossetti and Mannel were familiar with, operated to moderate fasting, so it didn't become excessive. Because that kind of excess to harken back to Evans, is indicative of self-focus. The moderation that they used enabled an outward focus to the community. To this end, I'm looking at Rossetti's Lenten poetry and her theological work, The Face of the Deep. And with Mennel, I'm looking at her ode to the body. And in these texts, I'm reading fasting as a material, ethical act as much as an act of spiritual edification. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. In fact, they had to go together. The Anglo-Catholic approach to fasting was, as Anna Silva notes, that people must eat because the body requires food, but they should only eat as much as their health demands, not merely for pleasure. And it's in this vein that Rossetti's and Mennel's social vision and religious motivation merged to constitute their understanding of fasting. Rossetti's heritage as a theologian and poet is really well documented and closely connected to her awareness of social justice issues. In The Face of the Deep, her understanding of fasting not only depicts the idea of spiritual discipline, but a physical discipline that prepares the body for times of scarcity and alerts the mind to the need to provide for the poor. The Face of the Deep is a very dense text with many threads. It's around 800 pages long, 600 pages long, and it's quite esoterical in parts. But the aspect I'm focusing on is Rossetti's critique of the consumerism and excess of an unhealthy Britain, revealed in the perverse gap between the rich and the poor. She writes, "Alas, England, full of luxuries and thronged by stinted poor, whose merchants are princes and whose dealings crooked, whose packed storehouses stand amid bare homes, whose gorgeous array has rags for neighbours, from a canker in our gold and silver, from a moth on our garments, from blasted crops, from dwindling substance, from righteous retribution abasing us among the nations, good Lord, deliver us." Regular corporate fasting is meant to remind the fasters of their responsibility to each other, as well as the disbalances of human society in contrast to the justice of providence. In her reading of Revelation 6, verses 5 to 6, Rossetti uses a pair of balances to represent famine, to acknowledge that famine is not a state of there not being enough, but of some individuals or particular sections of society not having enough. She writes, "Famine, yet not absolute foodlessness, else why the pair of balances?" She draws out the added horror, not just of lack, but of some having, while others who do not have look on in hunger. She continues, "The balances suggest scarcity short of literal nullity, hunger, but not necessarily starvation. Scarcity imposes frugality, exactness, a gathering up of fragments with thanksgiving because there remain fragments to gather. No waste, latitude, margin. No self-pampering can be tolerated, but only a sustained self-denial. Self must be stinted, selfishness starved, to give to him that needeth." Within this context, I want to look at one of Rossetti's Lenten poems, Mid-Lent. Now, this poem has a really interesting publication history. It's obviously a sonnet and was originally published in 1885 in Time Flies as the entry for December 9 without the Lenten title. So it originally wasn't specifically associated with Lent. But in her later volume Verses, she included this poem under the section Some Feasts and Fasts with this title. The change of signification interests me because it lends itself to the idea that fasting is meant to be something that happens all year round, in December, in Advent, as much as in Lent. So not just at those particular times in the calendar. Without time to go into a full close reading of the poem, I just want to draw attention to a couple of moments that gesture towards physical and social health. First of all, there's the weariness associated with hunger. The poem can be read in terms of spiritual nourishment through physical self-denial, But in the context of Rossetti's theological prose, it can also be read as encouraging the reader to have some perspective on their own privilege and to rethink what they consider weariness or hunger in comparison to those in real want, as opposed to those who can choose to fast. The outward community focus is made evident in the awe of, or build of loneliness, thy secret nest. Yes, fasting is meant to be done secretly in private, but it doesn't have to be lonely. The alternative to having an outward focus in fasting is to be isolated from the community through self-interest. Furthermore, the next line has an intriguing reference to being mindful of the West. Yes, this is the setting sun, but it also relates to the positioning of the altar in the Anglican and Catholic churches. There was a debate at this time about whether priests should face away from the congregation towards the altar, thereby facing the east, or the rising sun, which represents God, or if they should stand behind the altar facing the congregation, therefore facing the west. Therefore, in Rossetti's poem, strength for the fast must be found in facing the people, focusing on the community's need as the reason to continue. It's that outward focus that enables one to, at night, wake hope and be still yet faint, yet still pursuing. Rossetti confronts human selfishness and fear with resilience determined by an outward purpose. In Rossetti's vision, the ethics of fasting are tied incontrovertibly to feeding the hungry. So the practice of fasting implies the practice of giving to the poor. As much as Rossetti maintained the practice of liturgical fasting, including charitable work and giving, her literary and theological representations of fasting further elevate the material value of fasting as much as any spiritual benefit. Fasting is not just a spiritual practice, but a means to consume only what is necessary, sustaining not just the individual body, but by extension, the social. So turning to Alice Meynell, Meynell is someone who I doubt whether many people have actually heard of before, but she was a formidable force in late Victorian journalism and poetry. She was the president of the Society of Women's Journalists and twice touted for Poet Laureate. She missed out after Tennyson to Robert Bridges, I believe. But who's heard of Robert Bridges these days? She wasn't Poet Laureate, but she was also an influential figure in the women's suffrage movement. So this is all to say she had a very real impact on the writing profession as well as on the British social vision. She knew what it meant to struggle financially, which gave her a particular empathy for the impoverished in Britain. Food and fasting were particularly complex issues for her and inflected every aspect of her work and life. She really provides an interesting study for one who desired to fast for her own spiritual edification, but the evidence we have suggests that this motive was very mixed with others. So she's one, she has been classed as anorexic in the past by some researchers, mainly because she had some kind of interesting adolescent dietary fads, including one of eating only beetroot. But I argue that some of these diets were due to, she suffered from a lot of childhood illness. And I think actually she was looking for a diet that was going to make her healthier. And we know now that beetroot is a superfood, so she was on the right track. The other thing about Meynell, though, is that she had some really severe dental problems to the extent that by the time she was 20, she had dentures. Because she'd had so many teeth extractions. So if you think about that, eating would have been painful as well. And now this is a special mention for some people here. There was a particular case in Meynell's diary where she was told that she wasn't allowed to fast for 2 days because she was going to be leeched. Meynell was upset about this, most likely because it forced her to break with the liturgical practice of fasting on Wednesdays. It was quite common. You weren't supposed to fast before being leeched because, energy and so forth, blood loss, which was a bit upset. For Mennel, though, although fasting was about disciplining the body in spiritual terms, her austerity wasn't wholly wrapped up in this idea for the sake of her own spiritual growth, but as a way to make real room for the poor, to have more money in order to provide for them. The considerations at play for her are both personal and ethical. So one of my favourite anecdotes is the Mennels were very popular in literary circles in London. They were connected with everyone, but people hated to go to their place for dinner because the food was always really plain and bland. Because Alice Mennel didn't think it was really important to buy lots of special groceries, and she deliberately stinted on her groceries deliberately so that she would have more money to give to charities. And so she is a very clear example of that personal restraint and the restraint of her family for the sake of giving to those who are less fortunate. And this brings me to Mennel's poem. The intense sensory experience it engages with reflects the awareness of the body that George Moore, who I mentioned earlier, suggests is good for one, when the tastes, smells, and textures of food are made more acute by their absence. It's in this understanding that the appreciation of the lack that others experience comes into play. It's also in the discipline of the body that one recognises the authority one has over one's own body, and therefore a sense of empowerment that one can choose for that body to act, essentially to alleviate injustice. Mennel's ode presents the authority and responsibility of the disciplined body in a fragmented, chaotic, unhealthy community. In this poem, the impulse to discipline the body is written through an ethical stance, recognising the grotesque, unhealthy nature of excess in a world in which there is a significant deprivation. The individual's body, not their mind or their heart, is the arena in which social impulses are formed. The body is the ultimate council of judgment, palace of decrees, and it's the high senses that hold spiritual state within this palace, not the spirit or the soul, nor is it the Holy Spirit. Mennel asserts that it is through the senses that individuals perceive the world, including the perception of want. The senses determine the extent to which one sees the poverty, hears the cries of the suffering, and is willing to act, to sign, approve, accept, conceive, create. It's important that create is repeated across stanzas, and the capacity to act very quickly becomes a command to intervene. The entire poem turns on thy senses close with the world's pleas, an interrogation of the willingness with which individuals close their eyes and ears to the plight of others. It stands to reason, then, that Mennel follows this observation with a sensory invasion. The random odours reach their sweetness in the palace of thy repose. Upon thy tongue the peach, and in thy nostrils breathes the breathing rose. There's an irony in these aesthetically pleasing smells, tastes, and touches. In the belief of the sensory spontaneity and randomness, Mennel challenges the underlying compulsion to ignore other odours. Death, decay, and dank don't seem to impose themselves on this body in the same way that the peaches and roses do. The aesthetic compulsion ironically reveals that in being sensorially selective, this body is actually disordered and unhealthy. The image of the light groping for the eyes of the one who refuses to see, who desires to seclude themselves from the trials of the world, of the dark vibrations creating a noise to counteract the sightless skies, speaks to invasive disorder. Yet Mennel gives agency to the body with purpose and responsibility in thou dost command the sun. One can do something, and the belief that one is powerless is a myth that sustains selfishness, greed, excess, and complacency. In the final stanza, the body is reordered, placed in subjection to God, which is the position that fasting is meant to evoke. The final two lines are deliberately hierarchical, with the reference to the body's power to call up the day, a further reference to the body's power to command the sun, being juxtaposed with the greater authority of God. This final line reminds the individual that in their power to choose to see, to hear, to feel, to act, they will ultimately be answerable to God for their actions and inaction. I've spoken about the body as the individual body and the choices individuals make in responding to hunger, poverty, and social injustice. The body to which Mennel speaks is the body of Christ, so a challenge to the Christian church to do its duty in serving the community, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. But it's also the social body, so the broader British society, including its institutions of power and authority, the ones who have power to legislate for social change. Within the broader context of the conversations between medicine and theology that developed throughout the century, moderated fasting enables the individual body to sustain its own strength and that of the nation. The health of the nation depends on the capacity of individuals to live actively in an attitude of interdependence, each individual's health determining and being determined by that of the social body. Thank you very much.
But we do have time for some questions for Dr. Scholl, and I will bring the mic to you if you have questions. So just raise your hand.
What are your findings articles that you reference in your speech?
Yeah, so the question was, I can shout, and that won't be very useful for the recording. We'll be patient, we'll use this one. Okay, most of the material I've been finding I located upstairs in the Armstrong Browning Library. So the Bridgewater Treatise. And what's really interesting is a lot of them are available now as digital copies. However, I wouldn't have been able to identify the Bridgewater Treatises as a set if I hadn't pulled up the actual books. Because I was just doing a random search and found, these texts. I thought, hang on, this binding is exactly the same. And I realised that they were a part of this series. And so being able to access those physical texts was really important. But pretty much all of these articles, all of these books, I've located here at the Armstrong Browning Library.
Thank you, that's very special. To what extent do you see that the use of diet to regulate spiritual growth as just another manifestation of colonial traditions going back many centuries before it coming out in a new way with a new social account dimension?
So for the people who I'm looking at, they were very much influenced by the Oxford movement, so it was very much tied to trying to go back to the primitive church and ideas of English Catholicism, so going back to the church before the Reformation. And so it really was trying to connect with those practices. It did deviate, so some of the Oxford movement, a lot of them ended up converting to Roman Catholicism, so everyone's fears were justified. But a lot of them took to fasting in that really ascetic kind of way, and that real self-denial, that almost punishment of the body. That was one direction that they took. With the people who I'm working with, they were really trying to be much more via media with the approach. They did not want to go off into the extremes, but they did want to have that sense of discipline. But a part of that discipline was not also to not go into that extreme of asceticism. So I think that's one of the key differences. And something that's interesting with remarks on fasting as well is that I was just talking to Josh a bit earlier that the reason why I think, for instance, that he published the tract anonymously initially was because he was known to be very good friends with John Henry Newman. And Newman had only converted to Roman Catholicism 3 years earlier. And Newman was very much into the
hair shirt version of fasting, denial of the flesh, and or punishing the flesh, denial of the body. And so this group was really trying. Well, they aren't actually one group, but they were very much influenced by that idea of going back to the primitive church and primitive church practices. And what they believed was the impulse behind that. But there are so many other religions as well, where, like Islam during Ramadan, where fasting is meant to be connected to social justice and having that ethical agenda behind it, rather than just being about one's own spiritual discipline. The spiritual discipline part is really important, but the point is that if you really are growing spiritually, that means you're going to be more Christ-like, in which case you're going to be caring more about other people. And so that will be a natural flow-on effect from any kind of spiritual growth that fasting brings about. Hope that answers your question, kind of.
Dr. Scholl, this is going to take a little bit more on the body politic end than the body spiritual end. But how did this is at the point of the expansion of the British Empire and the establishment of the British Empire. And this seems very, the examples you've chosen so far seem very localized. Do you think come out into the larger British Empire and the whole healthcare body of the British Empire at any point? Has that turned out in the research at all?
Arlene, one of my favorite librarians. We can work on that next week. So my focus really has been on Britain. I know that a lot of so not British Empire. There are a lot of texts in America that are emerging at the same time, and a lot of engagement in the Methodist movements and the evangelical movements in the state. Not so much in the Episcopalian, interestingly enough, but more the evangelical sort of side of things, where people, they're really interested in what the Tractarians are talking about in regard to fasting. And throughout the century, I was looking at some material from the 1880s the other day when I got distracted. So definitely there's that cross-pollination going on, which we see in so many areas, so it's not really surprising. But between the US and Britain, there's definitely that sort of cross-pollination also going on to onto continental Europe. But in my research on hunger, I guess when I started working on it, I guess I kind of deliberately restricted myself to Britain, because once you start talking about empire, you've got all of the famines in India. You've got, I do engage slightly with Ireland and all of the famines in Ireland, but really only insofar as the Irish were migrating to mainland Britain. And there are other interesting cases that you could look at as well, such as the second fleet to Australia all died of starvation. So pretty much, you see. And now I'm conscious I've got other Australians in the room, so I've got to be careful what kind of generalisations I make. But the second fleet did not survive because there was not food available to them. So there were those sorts of things going on as well. It would be interesting to look at what kinds of conversations were going on there. But yeah, really, and a lot of my research ends up very London-based as well. Which I guess I justify in being the economic and cultural sort of centre of the empire. But yeah, it would be a lifelong project. Thank you for giving that to me. I appreciate it.
We have time for perhaps one more question. Yeah.
Who wants to see a picture of my puppy?
Can I steal the privilege? So it struck me, and I know you're always concerned to think about how does what we study in the Victorian past cast light upon our present. And I couldn't help but thinking, here's a moment when consumption is taking off in a remarkable, troubling way. with an imperial engine behind it. And the whole world is feeding this consumption that's going on. And yet you have these figures who are trying to say, with the rhythm of the church liturgy through the year that guides us into restraining our bodies, this isn't just about ourselves and our own spirituality, this is about training a sense of social responsibility by restraining our consumption. What do you do in a society when much time and regulation of our life has been secularized? When restraint has to do with maybe perfecting one's own body and diet, but not necessarily a sense of obligation. So in other words, by losing sacred time and by losing a sense of that regulation of our bodies, have we also lost a sense of social responsibility?
No, well, the short answer is yes. I think that's really true. But I think a lot of the things you're talking about, this is precisely what these figures were trying to address. Just that all of the diet fads that were happening then around, there are a lot of, this is when vegetarianism and veganism began as well. Though veganism was called fruitarianism. So really cool. And also then later in the 19th century, the obsession with exercise as well and physical strength, very much about it. It's also the height of the empire and the idea of consumption and getting more, and really, the real entrenchment of, consumer capitalism and more is better. And I think that where we see connections today, we've got, on the diet side of things, we do have that, on one hand, the obesity epidemic that everyone talks about, but also what I personally think of some really dangerous dieting fads, like the fasting diets that exist. But those fasting diets have absolutely nothing to do with, as you say, social justice or anything like that. It's really about the body. But I would actually say that relates more to hating one's body and punishing one's body than anything that Newman came up with. And so I think there's a real concern there. I've had a couple of interesting questions in Texas talking about my research. One was, so you're saying that we have to eat less? Yes, except at tailgates. Especially tomorrow. I think one of the things that, a question, we ended up talking in yesterday's workshop around, we're talking about one of the things that happened at the turn of the century into the 19th century, where there were a lot of food shortages. Both houses of Parliament in Britain signed pledges that they and their families were going to reduce the amount of bread that they ate from a loaf of bread a week to a quarter of a loaf of bread a week. In order to, and they were sent out trying to get the entire nation to go into this kind of bread restriction to make more food available to the entire nation. And this actually came from community groups, and then Parliament took it up. And so I asked, this report was one of the texts that we looked at yesterday, and I asked the group there, so could you imagine anyone doing that this day and age? And they're like, no, why not? And they listed all very, very intelligently all of these reasons why. The kind of society we are actually isn't that much different from 19th century Britain. But I didn't want that to stop there. It's like, well, rather than being defeatist about this kind of situation, are there ways that we could do something about it? And so anyway, I said to the group, well, okay, that's a bit of a shame because that's your job now. You've got to convince people to do that. That was their task. And they came up with a great idea for water restriction, which of course is absolutely, a huge issue for Texas with water supply, but also for food production. You kind of need water. And it was a fantastic idea. It was one of the best ideas that the whole group came up with. To one of the toughest questions, like how do you get people to get on board with restricting, to think about other people perhaps, And that's one of the biggest challenges. But the reality is, I think, that if you take away the moral compass from that, you know, how do you get people to think about other people? So, yeah.
Well, thinking of other people and your needs as well. I'm going to invite up for French, the curator of Armstrong Library, who will welcome you first.
Thank you very much for sticking around for this afternoon, and thank you again, Dr. Scholl, for your really fascinating, thought-provoking, and potentially personally applicable lecture this afternoon. And I'd like to invite everyone to come down to the Cox Reception Hall as we conclude the Benefactors Day program for a light reception and maybe your light dinner.